Well, hello, this is Adam, and welcome to Rare Classic Cars. Today we're going to be talking about a key vehicle in Lincoln history, the 1972 Mark IV. We've talked a little bit about it in the videos with Mark, where we compared his improperly colored black 1972 Mark IV to my 1972 Continental. But this is the correct color for a Mark IV. If you want a more 70s color, there's nothing more 70s than this. This is gold glamour metallic from the Ford color palette, but Lincoln called it yellow gold moon dust. So unique color on this vehicle. I said unique again. Let's call it a special color. In any case, the Mark IV was a really interesting vehicle with a even more interesting design history. And it really was a car that perhaps typified the battle between Bunkie Knudsen at Ford, who was just hired by Henry Ford II as president around the time this car was being developed, and Lee Iacocca, who was vice president in charge of sales for Ford. So Bunkie Knudsen came in as president, kind of one above Lee Iacocca. And you have to remember that the Mark III was Lee Iacocca's baby, where he famously basically said, take a Thunderbird, put a Rolls-Royce grill on it, and that's what I want. And the designers really just did not care for that type of a proposal and hated working on it. And yet the Mark III was very, very successful from a sales perspective, selling, 25, 30,000 units a year. So when Bunkie Knudsen enters the Ford picture and views design as being really his area of expertise and his decision to select final designs, it was something that was tough for Iacocca to digest. And the story goes, is told in a book by Jim and Cheryl Farrell called Lincoln Design History. Highly recommend that if you're interested in learning more about Lincoln design. That Bunkie Knudsen kind of came into the studio one day early in the morning and asked a clay modeler to unveil different things they were working on, one of which was Wes Dahlberg's proposal for the Mark IV. Now, Wes Dahlberg was an individual who was a Ford designer. He had spent time in Europe designing the Ford Taunus, which some people credit as giving Elwood Engel the inspiration for the 1961 Continental. I'll let you decide, putting the pictures in there. But in any event, Wes Dahlberg had repatriated to the US by this point and was kind of working on a Mark IV proposal that nobody really paid attention to. And it wasn't until Bunkie Knudsen came in and saw Dahlberg's proposal for this particular vehicle that he said, I want that car to go into production unaltered. He wanted it basically as is. Now, at the time, you have to remember that, again, this car was something that really was not well regarded by the Ford design team. And Gene Bourdonnais, who was in charge of the studio at the time and Dahlberg's boss, basically, heard what Bunkie Knudsen wanted and then started trying to alter the Mark IV more in line with what he thought it should be. But this happened repeatedly, but Bunkie Knudsen kept saying, no, I want Wes Dahlberg's proposal unaltered. And Lee Iacocca, I think, and Gene Bourdonnais were kind of conspiring a bit here. They even had an alternate Mark IV proposal that had a far more radical overall design, especially in the rear, that they wanted to see into production. And they kept it going and kept this alternate clay model going with the hope that, kind of knowing that Bunkie Knudsen wasn't going to work out as president of Ford, that Henry Ford II was going to let him go, and then they would get to put their Mark IV into production, and this one would just kind of go by the wayside. By the time everything played out, it was too late, and the design for this Mark IV was locked. And in general, it went through to production relatively unaltered. There are some changes, but this is pretty close to what Dahlberg's original proposal was. And some interesting features about this one is they really wanted to have, as opposed to the Mark III, and a lot of Lincolns of the time, very slab-sided, kind of look like they're designed with a T-square. This is totally different. You've got quite curved body sides with relatively soft feature line on them. And then you also have these fender tips that gradually go downward toward the front of the car. And the Mark III is pretty straight. And the designers thought it was so straight that your eye actually thought that it curved upward at the end. So this was different in terms of the overall theme from the Mark III. They also wanted to make sure it had this so-called rooftop hood with the point, a little bit a la Cadillac. And in general, they liked this theme, but they were having initial problems with the transition to this relatively high deck lid. And that's when the design team came up with this idea for, at the side, the belt line sweeping up and then allowing that high deck lid to be facilitated in a rather graceful fashion. So Dahlberg's team worked on this, and really it was, I think this car made it through to production. As I said, the timing was just too late for it to be changed to the alternate proposal. But according to the story, Lee Iacocca kept ordering different changes to this car as the years went on, wanting to try to put his stamp on it. So perhaps some of the 73 front end and then the 74 back end is more in line with what he wanted. The designers also raised, after a few model years, this roof line, try to accommodate the moonroof, and consequently put that half vinyl top on it to disguise the fact that the roof had been raised. So a lot of different, I'll say, interesting things to get this car through to production. And because it's a 1972, it's a one-year only design with the front end that does not have the 5-mile-an-hour impact standard, nor is there an impact standard in the rear. In 73, this front end would change very significantly. The grille would change, it would get the big bumper. And in 74 in particular, the whole rear end would have to change to accommodate the 5-mile-an-hour rear standard. This car is based on the Thunderbird platform from the year, but it does share quite a few Torino components, actually. And that was the basis for some of these components that were used on this Mark IV. So this car sold for $8,600, a little over $8,600 new in 1972. The Cadillac Eldorado's base price was about $1,000 less than that. And yet, this car in 1972 sold almost 50,000 units. Sold in the high 40,000 units. The Eldorado, coupe and convertible, there's never convertible offered of this car from the factory, sold about 40,000 units. And in 1973, the sales for the Mark IV went to about 60,000 units. So this car was by far an absolute home run for Lincoln, and it took away the personal luxury coupe crown in this segment from the Eldorado in spite of it being priced higher, which to me is really shocking. I mean, I think both cars are good looking. It is amazing to me that this car was priced, let's say 15% plus above the Eldorado, and was able to outsell it. Now, there are some other interesting features about this. Let's take the camera off and walk around the vehicle and talk more about them. So as we walk around the car, the first thing to note here are these wheel arches that are rather subtly modeled here into the sheet metal. And if you look at the alternate proposals for the Mark IV, the wheel arches were far more pronounced, kind of carried through the whole body side. But this was the proposal that Wes Dahlberg and his team had envisioned, as well as this kind of soft crease line, unfortunately disguised by this molding here, but a relatively soft crease line where the body would kind of curve and rotate up inward toward the roof. Very different from the full-size Continental of the area that was much more vertically oriented in terms of its shapes. This car does have the optional grille guard on it, which means there's a hole in the bumper behind here to mount it. You can take these off. You can take the grille guard off, but you're left with a half-inch hole on either side. And I think the grille definitely looks better without the bumper guard, but I've left it on. This car was ordered with it. And as I said, this is Yellow Gold Moon Dust is the name of this Lincoln color. And in the cloudy, let's say on the cloudy days, it doesn't look all that great. It kind of looks like a mustardy, muddy yellow. But on a sunny day like this, being a metallic paint, I mean, it pops on this car, I think. It works really well. You can see all of the distinct creases of the hood. I mean, it's throwing a shadow on itself, as Mark would say, to really give you that visual light breakage. One thing about these Lincolns, compared to the Cadillacs of the era as well, as I will say, having owned both, and owning both still, is that the Lincoln build quality is definitely better than the Cadillac. All the Class A surfaces of these Lincolns was done by the Budd Company. It was done outside of Ford's in-house operations. And that was to make sure that they could get this consistency of fit, which they didn't feel they could get in-house. And the gaps on this car are pretty good. They're not as good as my 72 Continental, the full-size car, but they are really good. And the one thing that you'll notice, particularly on Fords of this era, you open the door, you close it, and it just has this great sound to it that Cadillac never had. The Cadillac doors would tend to sag over time, you know, and then you start getting huge gaps. This gap is actually pretty big up here on this side, but you'd get really big gaps where you could put your pinky through them on the Cadillacs. They just didn't have that good a quality of sheet metal stamping. And like I said, Lincoln had to go out of house for this to the Budd Company. This car also introduced this logo for Lincoln, kind of a slimmed down version of the overall Lincoln logo, and quite handsome, and carried on Lincolns for many years. And Mercury stole it, kind of rotated it 90 degrees, put a wreath around it and some slats on it, and called it the Lincoln Mercury crest for 73 and 74. And then in 75, Mercury had this kind of a logo with a wreath around it. Something else on these cars that's interesting is this opera window, which in 72 only was an optional feature, later became standard. And the story has it that this opera window was originally proposed for Mercury as an idea to try to get Mercury sales to increase. One of those design features that would help them and differentiate them. And it eventually made its way to a Ford Thunderbird proposal in the late 60s. But Lee Iacocca said save it for Lincoln. And so it was introduced on Lincoln here on the Mark IV as, I think, an $80 option. Most people ordered it, and it provided not only some style but also enhanced visibility. One of the things you can notice how big this C-pillar is on this car. It's huge. The opera window actually really helps the visibility, especially given there's no passenger side mirror on this car, which was typical from the period, not having a passenger side mirror. It's almost necessary. But consequently on these cars, because of the opera window, this back glass only retracts maybe an inch and a half before it has to stop, before it hits the opera window here. So you can see actually where, you know, there's some, this is just residue from this touching the rubber seal here, but this is as far as the glass goes back when I've had it back. It only retracts that amount back into the C-pillar, does not retract down. As we look out back, you have this theme with horizontal taillights. If you look at one of the original Dahlberg proposals, the taillights were actually in this feature here in the fin, kind of a la 67 Eldorado. But that later moved so that the lights were in the bumper. And of course you have the faux tire hump. There's nothing here, but it's just pure style, but it carries into the bumper, you know, at least in 72 and 73, creating a really nice theme. And again, this paint color in the sunlight accentuates all of the feature lines and creases quite nicely. You also have, similar to what John Manoogian was talking about on the Cadillacs, you kind of have this low belt line here in the glass area. I should say relatively low. You also have a low roof line. This is only about a foot between the roof line and the top of the belt line here. There is not much area, but you notice that the deck lid is higher than the belt line, and it kind of gives it this shrunken back window look, which was also a technique that John employed on the 85 Cadillacs, kind of pulling this collar up to get the backlight to shrink, to make it more formal and give it a bit different appearance. This does have the Cavalry twill vinyl top. The top, you can tell these if they're original by the fabric grain, which is tough to get now, and also by the fact that they're only padded here on the sides. This section of the roof, inboard of the seam, is not padded. So this is not. Turning to the inside, this used the same Thunderbird dash, but it has a different theme. Thunderbird had round gauges. Here we have square gauges, very driver-centric orientation. It's a huge instrument panel, very vertically oriented. It would also get kind of reused in the Mark V. But it's so big that if you sit in the driver's seat, you can't even visually see the brake pedal. It kind of is covered by the instrument panel. This does have the 3-spoke wheel, the non-cruise wheel. Cruise control cars got a 2-spoke wheel with the cruise buttons on them. It does have the rim blow feature, as did the cruise wheel. You pinch the horn, the ring here, and the horn honks. This one is also tilt. You tilt the forward wheels by pushing the turn signal forward. It does have Twilight Sentinel, which is this lever here, to activate the automatic headlamp dimmer, which is a sensor in the grille. It does have power seats, power windows. Be careful on these Lincolns of this vintage. Make sure your power seat contacts are clean. Take this out, clean it. These have been known to catch fire now, many years later. I always consequently unhook the battery when I store this car long term, just to make sure that nothing has a chance of happening, because power is always running to that seat switch. It's always hot. So let me demonstrate the opera window operation here. So it's fully extended right now, and here's how far back it goes. That's it. That is the extent of its travel on an opera window car. Door locks on this car, as opposed to the Mark III, were electric, so you push down on them and they activate both sides, so you can watch over there. Or you can pull up. And make a better noise than the GMs, which sound like a cell block unlocking. In the back, we really don't have much in terms of rear seat leg room, as you can see. I mean, this is really minimal. After all the years, the automatic seat back unlocker isn't totally working on this car, but no big deal. Here's a better look at the dash. You have the Cartier clock, of course. This does have SureTrack anti-lock brakes. It's a huge big pump under hood in the car that controls that. It does have AM/FM radio with power antenna. The antenna switch is down here to activate it. It doesn't come on with the radio like the GM cars. And, you know, the dash, it's got these two faux wood grains, kind of a burl pattern and something else. And it just doesn't look as rich. The materials in this are not as rich as the Mark III, and yet this car outsold the Mark III by 2-to-1. But this interior is definitively cheaper. I mean, the door panels really aren't anything special. But I guess it didn't matter for style. You can also see how squinty this greenhouse is in this car. It's almost like a modern-day Camaro or Mustang. There's not even a foot of vertical distance from the top of this dash pad to the top of the windshield. And there's about a foot on the side glass. So this is really, I would call it almost a modern day proportion car, but of course you have no blind spot monitoring system or even a passenger side mirror. So it's interesting from an overall practicality perspective. GM really never had these kind of proportions on a car of this era. So it was more of a Ford thing. They pop the trunk. You can hear the great key buzzer. And overall, this car isn't very roomy on the inside. In fact, it's pretty compact, which is humorous given the thing's size. I mean, this car is 220 plus inches long, but it's 6 feet of hood. And I think the amazing thing about it is the trunk is small. How do you get a small trunk on a car this big? This is not a big trunk. I mean, I've got the car cover in here, and the full-size spare takes up almost everything. It is nicely trimmed. And you don't see kind of the cardboard pieces, although that is cardboard, carpeted cardboard, the Cadillacs had, but this trunk is not very big. Not a lot of vertical distance. It might be 14 cubic feet, but it's probably even a little bit less, which is, compared to the full-size Continental, is nothing. This car does have the fuel tank underneath here, whereas most of the full-size Fords have that big divot. And so you lose that trunk space. which isn't great. At least it closes nicely. Under hood, we have Ford's mighty 460 cubic inch 4-barrel V8, or 4 Venturi as they used to call it. By this point, making in the zip code of 200 horsepower, so nothing all that big to write home about. The compression was dropped in 1972 from 1971. Horsepower on this is, I want to say, 202 zip code. I think the Continental was a little more at 212 for the 460, but let's call it low 200 horsepower. Not very big. And we have a GM A6 air conditioning system and a GM Saginaw steering pump on this car. So Ford started using those. They couldn't get the cooling that they wanted with the typical York 2-piston compressor. Eventually, they would pretty much switch to this system and away from that York by the mid-70s. The car is a smooth runner, though, and I've added factory-style dual exhaust to this just to give it a little bit more of a ability to breathe. So here we'll start it up. Fast idle's on because it's cold. Like I said, I put dual exhaust on this with resonators. They came from the factory just with a single exhaust on the driver's side. And I would say, in spite of the relative lack of horsepower, you only have a little over 200 horsepower in this car, taking off from a stoplight or going 80 miles an hour on the freeway, no problem with this car at all. Tons of torque. Absolutely tons of torque. Passing power isn't as great as it was in earlier years, but it's still not bad, especially given this car is almost 5,000 pounds. This was also during a design phase for Ford where they, for whatever reason, loved these long overhangs, front and rear. GM would kind of try to push this front wheel further out to get more dash to axle, which is basically the distance between this point here and where the front wheel is. This car's got really long front overhang, really long rear overhang, so despite a apparently small wheelbase, if you will, compared to the full-size Continental, its overall length remains immense. So let's take one last walk around the Mark IV. Hope you enjoyed that presentation. And thanks again for watching. Thanks for watching this video of the Mark IV. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, as that helps the YouTube algorithm serve it up to more viewers like you. And until next time, check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, take care.